Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're diving headfirst into the world of Vikings, the longboats, the axes, the epic battles, and all the myths you've been told that are, well, mostly wrong. You know the ones: horned helmets, bloodthirsty raiders, and those so-called berserkers who supposedly tore through villages in a drunken frenzy. Yeah, those stories. They make for great movies and museum displays, but the reality, way more interesting, way more complex, and sometimes way weirder. I'm your guide through history, myth, and everything in between. Over the next few minutes, we're going to untangle centuries of exaggeration, misinterpretation, and flat-out storytelling gone wild. Museums have displayed Vikings like one-dimensional barbarians. Hollywood has glamorized them into action heroes, and somewhere in all that, the real Vikings, farmers, traders, explorers, and yes, warriors, got lost in translation. So grab your helmets, the real horn-free kind. Pour yourself a mead if you like, and let's set sail into the Viking world you thought you knew. Spoiler alert, almost everything you've heard might be wrong, but the truth is even cooler. As we leave behind the flashy images and overblown tales from movies and museum halls, it's time to get real. Let's strip away the horned helmets, the endless pillaging, and the dramatic berserkers, and take a closer look at the Vikings as they actually were. Not the caricatures we see on TV, not the bloodthirsty marauders etched in popular imagination, but real people with complex lives, beliefs, and societies. So, let's talk Vikings. For centuries, stories about these Scandinavian seafarers have been twisted and exaggerated, shaped by theatre, literature, and even tourism. And while those myths are entertaining, they obscure a truth that is far more fascinating. Vikings were farmers, traders, explorers, and yes, occasionally warriors, but their culture was nuanced, sophisticated, and deeply tied to their environment and beliefs. In this chapter, we're going to start by exploring the myths that have stuck hardest in our collective imagination. We'll see how these stories originated, why they persist in museums and media, and what archaeology and historical research actually tell us about the lives behind the legend. By the end of this, you'll start to see the Vikings in a whole new light, less as one-dimensional warriors, and more as a society that was inventive, resourceful, and surprisingly human. Before we get into the epic sagas and jaw-dropping raids, let's hit the pause button and talk about what you think you know. You've probably seen Vikings portrayed in movies, TV series, or even museum dioramas. Horned helmets, snarling warriors, frothing mead in hand, burning villages to the ground. It's dramatic, it's exciting, and, let's be honest, it's mostly wrong. I'm your historian guide for this journey. I'm here to separate the myth from the reality, to peel back centuries of exaggeration, and show you the humans behind the legends. And trust me, the real Vikings are far cooler than the caricatures Hollywood and history textbooks have handed down. So why do these myths exist in the first place? Part of it comes down to theatre. In the 19th century, during the Romantic period, Scandinavia experienced a cultural revival. Playwrights and artists wanted to make Viking stories thrilling and heroic. Enter the horned helmets, literally pulled out of imagination rather than archaeology. Actors needed visual cues that screamed Viking to audiences, and audiences loved it. That image stuck. Museums, needing to appeal to the public's expectations, didn't exactly correct it. They leaned into it, and voila, the horned helmeted warrior became the default Viking in our minds, and it doesn't stop there. Think about the constant bloodthirsty raider image. Yes, Vikings conducted raids, but not non-stop, and certainly not without reason. Raiding was a tool, a political maneuver, an economic strategy, a response to environmental pressures. In reality, most Vikings were farmers, merchants, and craftsmen. Their villages were bustling with families, trade goods, livestock, and routines that had nothing to do with burning monasteries. Yet the violent imagery persisted because it sells, both in museums and on screens. Even the notorious berserkers, the mad warriors who supposedly went into trance-like states and tore through enemies, deserve a reality check. The truth? These accounts were often exaggerated, symbolic, or ritualized. Berserkers may have been elite fighters with psychological or cultural practices that set them apart, but they weren't the uncontrollable killing machines legend claims. Museums haven't helped either. A Viking sword displayed with dramatic labels about conquest might omit the fact that it was more likely used in ceremonial contexts or defensive skirmishes. Dioramas of longhouses with overly aggressive warriors overshadow the fact that these homes were centres of family, trade, and daily life. Visitors leave thinking Vikings equals violent raiders, instead of seeing the complex societies that existed. But here's the exciting part. Behind these myths, there's a story that's richer, stranger, and more human. Vikings farmed in harsh climates, navigated open seas with astonishing skill, traded across continents, and left behind artifacts that tell tales of everyday life, art, and belief. Their sagas, the written and oral stories, blend history, legend, and poetry, giving us glimpses into their morality, humour, and ambitions. All right, guys, let's tackle the big one. If you picture a Viking in your head, chances are there's a shiny metal helmet with two curved horns jutting out on either side. Maybe you've seen it in cartoons, movies, or even souvenir figurines. But here's the truth. Vikings never, ever wore horned helmets in battle. Not once. So where did this idea come from? Surprisingly, it has less to do with history and more to do with 19th century theatre, art, and cultural romanticism. During the Romantic period, artists and playwrights were obsessed with the Viking Age. It was a way to create a heroic, dramatic version of the past. A past that felt raw, exciting, and larger than life. Opera productions, in particular, needed visually striking imagery. Horned helmets became a theatrical shorthand. If a character wore one, audiences instantly recognised them as Viking. One of the most famous early examples comes from the costume designs for Richard Wagner's operas, where horned helmets were all the rage on stage. These weren't meant to be accurate, they were meant to look epic. Audiences ate it up, and artists painted Vikings in full horned glory. Museums, wanting to make Viking exhibits appealing and dramatic, sometimes adopted these artistic clichés, further embedding the myth in public consciousness. Archaeology tells a very different story. Actual Viking helmets that survive to this day are simple, functional, and horn-free. Most were made of iron or leather, designed to protect the head in battle, not to intimidate with fanciful curves. One of the most complete finds, the Gjermundbu helmet from Norway, is a rounded iron cap with a simple nasal guard. Practical, effective, and very far from what Hollywood sells. Yet, despite this evidence, the horned helmet persists. Why? Because humans love symbols. Horns are dramatic, visually striking, and easy to remember. They signal Viking in a single glance. And let's face it, a round metal cap without horns doesn't quite have the same cinematic flair. Hollywood doubled down on the myth. Movies and TV series often exaggerate, adding horns, oversized axes, and snarling expressions. Even educational materials and Viking experiences for tourists sometimes replicate the horns for dramatic effect. Over time, the public began to associate horns with Vikings so strongly that questioning it feels almost sacrilegious. But once you understand the truth, you start noticing it everywhere. Fictional Vikings with horns, museum displays, themed merchandise. It's all part of a long tradition of myth-making. The horned helmet myth isn't just a funny mistake, it tells us something bigger. It shows how cultural imagination can override historical fact, how storytelling, even unintentional, shapes our perception of history. And it sets the stage for other myths we'll encounter. The bloodthirsty raider, the uncontrollable berserker, the Viking as a one-dimensional warrior. Next up, we'll explore those raiders. Were Vikings constantly pillaging, destroying, and terrorizing Europe as legends suggest? Or was the reality far more strategic and nuanced? You'll be surprised at how little the popular image matches the archaeological and historical record. When you hear the word Viking, what pops into your head? Pillaging, plundering and burning villages, right? That's the image Hollywood, textbooks, and even some museum exhibits have drilled into our brains. But here's the truth. Vikings were not mindless marauders roaming Europe solely for destruction. Raiding was real, but it was far from constant. In fact, most Vikings spent the majority of their lives farming, trading, fishing and managing households. Raids were strategic and selective, often dictated by politics, economics, or opportunity rather than sheer bloodlust. A village was burned not out of hatred, but as a calculated move to secure resources, demand tribute, or assert influence. Historical records and archaeology give us clues. For instance, raids on monasteries were frequent targets not because monks were easy prey, but because monasteries stored wealth, silver, food, and goods that could sustain a Viking community. Still, these events were exceptions rather than the rule. Entire generations of Vikings lived lives that had little to do with violent conquests and the strategy. Vikings weren't sloppy or impulsive. They were skilled tacticians. Longships allowed for quick, stealthy attacks along rivers and coasts. They could strike suddenly, collect resources and retreat before enemy forces had time to respond. It was precision, mobility, and planning, not chaos. Moreover, raids were often part of broader political strategies. Alliances, marriages, and trade relationships played roles as critical as any battle. A successful raid could enhance a leader's reputation and influence, while a poorly executed one could spark retaliation. Violence was not random. It was a tool in a complex web of Viking social, economic, and political life. The myth of constant raiding is partly fueled by the dramatic sagas written centuries later. These stories glorified victories, exaggerated conflicts, and emphasized heroism. Over time, readers and audiences mistook these literary dramatizations for everyday reality. Museums and popular culture reinforced this misconception, showcasing raiding as the core of Viking identity. So, when you imagine Vikings, remember this. Raiding was episodic, strategic, and socially contextualized. Most Vikings were hard-working farmers and traders who engaged in combat only when it served a purpose. Their society was complex, balancing domestic life, trade networks, exploration, and occasional military campaigns. Next, we'll dive into the famous berserkers and their wild reputations. Were they truly unstoppable, raging warriors, or has legend painted them far beyond reality? As we'll see, cultural symbolism, ritual practices, and storytelling all played a role in creating the image of the savage Viking warrior. By separating these myths from reality, we start to see a pattern. Vikings were multifaceted people, not the caricatures we often encounter, and understanding this gives context to the next layer of myth-busting. When most people hear the word berserker, they picture a Viking gone completely wild. Foam at the mouth, eyes blazing, smashing anyone in their path with nothing but raw fury. Movies, cartoons, and even comic books have made this image iconic. But the reality, far more nuanced and surprisingly human. The term berserker literally means bear shirt in Old Norse. It referred to elite warriors who sometimes entered battle wearing animal pelts, possibly symbolizing the strength or spirit of the creature. Chroniclers describe them as fighting with extreme intensity, sometimes appearing impervious to pain, but historians and archaeologists caution that these accounts are often exaggerated or symbolic. Were they drunk? Possibly, but not in the way popular culture imagines. Some evidence suggests ritualistic intoxication, not mere drunken rampage. They may have consumed substances to induce trance-like states for focus, courage, or spiritual reasons. These states were ritualized and controlled, not uncontrolled rage as Hollywood shows. The myth of the savage berserker also reflects cultural storytelling. Sagas were written to inspire awe, emphasize heroism, and instill moral lessons. Exaggerating the warrior's ferocity made for better stories. It wasn't a literal account of everyday behaviour. Most Vikings did not live in this constant frenzied state. Berserker's image also served social and religious functions. They symbolised courage, fearlessness, and dedication to their leaders or gods. By portraying them as unstoppable warriors, sagas reinforced the ideals of strength, loyalty, and ritualised honour. It was storytelling meeting psychology. Understanding the truth behind berserkers changes how we see Vikings entirely. Instead of one-dimensional savage warriors, we begin to recognise a society with ritual, symbolism, and complex social roles. Even the most fearsome fighters had rules, traditions, and a sense of morality guiding their actions. Next, we'll look at how museums, intentional or not, have reinforced these myths. Dioramas, artifact labels, and exhibition choices often exaggerate violence and heroism, creating a perception of Vikings that is more legend than fact. By examining museum misrepresentations, we'll start seeing how myth and reality collide in the public imagination. Museums are meant to teach us history, right? But when it comes to Vikings, they sometimes do the opposite. Step into a typical Viking exhibit, and you'll see dioramas of warriors in horned helmets, longhouses filled with snarling fighters, and displays highlighting raids and battles. It's dramatic, it's visually striking, but it's not entirely accurate. Let's start with artifact labels. A sword might be described as used to conquer villages, when in reality it could have been ceremonial or primarily used for self-defense. Helmets, shields, and armour are often presented as tools of destruction rather than everyday equipment. Visitors leave thinking, Vikings equals constant violence, which is far from the truth. Then there are dioramas and life-size reconstructions. Museums want to create an experience, and that often means exaggeration. Longhouses are sometimes filled with warriors ready to strike, with fire crackling and axes raised, while in reality, these homes were bustling with daily life, cooking, crafting, raising children, and managing livestock. The mundane realities of Viking society rarely make it into exhibits because they aren't as cinematic. Even some famous museums in Scandinavia and beyond have perpetuated these myths. For instance, the early 20th century Viking exhibitions in Copenhagen and Oslo leaned heavily into romanticised versions of the past, portraying Vikings as noble savages or ruthless raiders. Modern curators are working to correct this, but the images created over decades are hard to shake from public imagination. What's more, interactive experiences like Viking reenactments or themed tourist attractions often prioritise spectacle over accuracy. You might find yourself swinging a sword in a reconstructed longhouse while wearing a horned helmet, thinking, this is what Vikings were like, when in fact, you're participating in a centuries-old myth-making tradition. The tension between myth and reality isn't just about accuracy, it's about storytelling. Museums know that dramatic, dangerous Vikings attract visitors. It's memorable and entertaining. But as we've been discovering, the real Vikings were far more complex. Skilled farmers, traders, craftsmen, and explorers who occasionally fought rather than living for battle alone. By understanding how museums have shaped our perception, we start to see the broader picture. Myths aren't just made by Hollywood or storytellers. They're reinforced by how history is presented to the public. And once you recognise that, it opens the door to uncovering the real Viking life, their personal stories, and the fascinating details that history books often skip. Next, we'll see how their daily experiences, relationships, and adventures paint a richer, far more engaging picture than the myths ever could. Now that we've peeled back the myths, horned helmets, bloodthirsty raiders, berserkers, and museum exaggerations, it's time to step closer to the people behind the stories. Because the Vikings weren't just symbols or stereotypes. They were farmers, traders, parents, storytellers, and adventurers. and their sagas, the epic tales passed down through generations, offer a glimpse into the humanity that often gets lost in the myths. Sagas are tricky. They mix history, poetry, and legend, often blurring fact and fiction. Yet, within these stories we find real emotions, moral dilemmas, and the everyday concerns of people who lived over 1,000 years ago. Love and loyalty, rivalry and revenge, ambition and fear, they're all there, embedded in tales that have survived centuries. Take, for example, the story of Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir, an Icelandic woman who voyaged to Greenland and even to North America long before Columbus. Her journeys are recorded in the sagas, blending adventure with practical survival, negotiations with indigenous peoples, and moments of profound courage. She wasn't a warrior in the Hollywood sense, but she was brave, resourceful, and influential, a reminder that Viking history is full of characters far richer than the one-dimensional raider. Then there are the smaller, everyday stories. The farmer who braves a harsh winter to protect his livestock, the craftsman whose carvings tell stories of gods and ancestors, the trader navigating distant coasts to exchange goods. These moments of life, love, and labour create a tapestry that's far more vivid than any exaggerated battle scene. And this is where history and legend intersect. Myths exaggerate, entertain, and inspire, but the sagas preserve memory, culture, and values. By looking at the lives behind the legends, we start to see Vikings as a people who navigated a harsh, unpredictable world with intelligence, skill, and creativity. The myths might have drawn attention to violence or spectacle, but the sagas reveal society, resilience, and humanity. As we move forward, we'll explore daily life in the longhouses, the roles of women, trade networks, and even the art and education that thrived in Viking communities. By understanding these realities, the myths we've debunked become more than just wrong facts. They become a gateway to a richer, more nuanced story of a fascinating civilization. So, leave the horned helmets and berserkers behind for a moment, and let's step into the real Viking world, a world of daily life, complex society, and untold adventures waiting to be discovered. When you think of Vikings, you probably picture epic battles, roaring warriors, and stormy seas. Rarely do we pause to imagine their homes, longhouses filled with families, chores, and everyday life. But the reality is that the longhouse was the heartbeat of Viking society, and inside those walls, history was happening quietly yet profoundly. A typical longhouse was long and narrow, made of timber with thatched roofs, designed to withstand harsh Scandinavian winters. It wasn't just a shelter, it was a hub of activity. Families lived together with their animals, often under the same roof, sharing warmth and resources. Smoke from the central hearth curled through the room, filling it with the smell of cooking stew, dried fish, and wood smoke. A far cry from the cinematic images of smoke-filled battle halls. Life inside was busy and structured. Men and women had clearly defined responsibilities, though everyone contributed in multiple ways. Men often tended livestock, fished, or prepared for seasonal raids and trade journeys. Women managed the household, cooked, spun wool, wove cloth, cared for children, and sometimes even participated in crafting weapons or tools. Children learned skills from both parents, training from a young age in farming, crafting, and navigation. Meals were simple but hearty: porridge, fish, preserved meats, vegetables, and dairy. Feasts were reserved for special occasions such as seasonal festivals, weddings, or religious ceremonies. These gatherings weren't just about food. They were moments to reinforce community bonds, share stories, and celebrate achievements. Music, singing, and storytelling were integral parts of daily life, keeping history and culture alive in ways that didn't require parchment or ink. Contrary to the violent image we often see, most Vikings spent their days working, trading, and maintaining their homes. Raiding was rare and strategic, not a full-time occupation. Instead, the longhouse was a place of planning, learning and nurturing, the literal foundation of Viking society. And yet, even in these modest homes, ambition and adventure were never far away. Plans for trade voyages, exploring new lands, or negotiating alliances were discussed around the hearth. Education wasn't formal, but storytelling, observation, and apprenticeship passed knowledge from one generation to the next. The longhouse was both a sanctuary and a springboard, giving Vikings the tools to thrive in an unpredictable world. Understanding this daily life reshapes the image of Vikings. They weren't just raiders or merciless warriors. They were people navigating a challenging environment, balancing survival, family, and community. The longhouse was their stage, the hearth their anchor, and their society was built on cooperation, skill, and resilience. Next, we'll explore the often overlooked role of Viking women, warriors, traders, and leaders, showing how their contributions went far beyond the domestic sphere and challenging even more myths about Viking society. When most people picture Vikings, women rarely come to mind. Hollywood often portrays them as passive figures, tucked away in longhouses, waiting for the men to return from battle. But the truth is far more fascinating. Viking women were far from powerless. They were leaders, traders, warriors, and integral members of society, shaping the culture in ways that have only recently come to light. Archaeology has revealed evidence that challenges old assumptions. Graves once thought to belong to men, filled with weapons, are now known to be women's. One striking example comes from Birka, Sweden, where a warrior grave contained a full arsenal: sword, spear, shield, and armour, alongside jewellery and household items. DNA testing confirmed the buried individual was female, showing that women could, and did, participate in warfare. But their influence wasn't limited to battlefields. Viking women managed farms, controlled households, oversaw trade, and handled legal matters when men were away on raids or expeditions. They could own property, inherit land, and wield significant authority in their communities. Some women even took leadership roles, acting as chieftains or influencing political alliances. Trading was another realm where women thrived. They managed the flow of goods like furs, amber, and jewellery, often travelling or negotiating with merchants themselves. The sagas mention women making shrewd decisions in both domestic and economic matters, proof that Viking society valued their acumen. Family and motherhood were central, but not restrictive. Women were educators too, passing down knowledge of farming, craft, navigation, and storytelling. These skills were crucial for maintaining communities and sustaining Viking culture across generations. And yes, there were warriors among them. The sagas and archaeological evidence show women taking up arms when necessary, defending homes or joining expeditions. They weren't a novelty. They were active participants in shaping Viking history. By understanding the roles of Viking women, we see that society was far more egalitarian than popular culture suggests. They were strong, intelligent, resourceful, and essential to the survival and success of their communities. The myth of the passive waiting woman dissolves when you consider the evidence. Viking women were everywhere, shaping life, commerce, and culture alongside men. Next, we'll take a closer look at trade, travel, and diplomacy, showing how Vikings were explorers and merchants, not just raiders, a side of them that most myths completely overlook. When the average person thinks of Vikings, the first images that come to mind are longships, axes, and raiding villages. But the real Vikings were far more than marauders. They were explorers, traders, and skilled diplomats, navigating vast networks that spanned continents. Viking trade routes were extensive. From the cold fjords of Scandinavia, they travelled to Byzantium, the Middle East, and even Central Asia, exchanging furs, amber, silver, and crafted goods. These journeys weren't chaotic adventures. They were well-planned expeditions requiring navigational skill, negotiation, and cultural understanding. The Vikings weren't just taking, they were also giving, bringing Scandinavian goods to distant lands and returning with luxuries, new ideas, and connections. Trade settlements like Hedeby in modern Germany or Birka in Sweden were bustling hubs of commerce. These towns weren't military outposts, they were centres of economy and culture. Merchants from distant lands mingled, exchanged goods, and navigated complex social protocols. Diplomacy was key. Vikings negotiated alliances, marriages, and agreements with local rulers to ensure access to trade routes and resources. Travel itself was an art. The longship, a marvel of engineering, allowed Vikings to navigate rivers, coasts, and open seas with surprising speed and efficiency. They mapped routes by observing stars, currents, and landmarks, developing a sophisticated understanding of geography long before modern navigation tools. Their journeys weren't reckless. They were calculated and deliberate, balancing risk with opportunity. This broader perspective reshapes the stereotypical image of Vikings. They weren't isolated raiders. They were participants in a global network of trade and diplomacy. Connections with Byzantium, the Islamic world, and even the early Rus states meant Vikings were culturally and economically integrated, absorbing and influencing ideas, techniques, and customs along the way. By focusing solely on raiding, popular culture erases this sophisticated side of Viking society. The reality is far richer. Vikings were entrepreneurs, negotiators, and skilled travellers who understood the value of connection as much as conquest. Next, we'll explore Viking religion, runes and rituals, diving into their spiritual life and clarifying misconceptions about their beliefs being purely violent or barbaric. Viking spirituality is often reduced to they worshipped violent gods and sacrificed freely, but their beliefs were far more complex and nuanced. The Norse pantheon included deities like Odin, Thor, and Freya, each representing different aspects of life: wisdom, protection, fertility, and prosperity. Religion guided daily decisions, social norms, and political alliances rather than merely justifying violence. Rituals were woven into life. Seasonal festivals marked sowing, harvest, and celestial events. Offerings, ranging from food to crafted objects, honoured the gods and ensured community well-being. Human sacrifice was rare and likely symbolic or ceremonial, not a routine practice. Runes, often associated with magic, were practical tools as well. They conveyed messages, commemorated achievements, and recorded trade agreements. Carved stones or wooden tablets weren't mystical gimmicks. They were an early form of literacy, blending spirituality with communication. The sagas and archaeological finds reveal a society where morality, law, and spirituality intersected. Ethics were guided by community values and the concept of honour, not just fear of wrathful gods. Viking religion provided structure, inspiration, and a sense of identity, influencing art, law, and everyday life. Next, we'll examine education and art, showing how Vikings expressed their culture through storytelling, crafts, and literacy, further challenging the barbaric stereotype. Vikings weren't just warriors or traders, they were also storytellers, artists, and surprisingly literate. Education in Viking society wasn't formal like today, but knowledge passed from one generation to the next was structured, intentional, and essential. Children learned farming, crafting, navigation, and the sagas, absorbing practical skills alongside cultural values. Storytelling was central. Sagas, poems, and oral histories preserved lore, genealogies, heroic deeds, and moral lessons. These weren't mere entertainment, they were the cultural backbone, teaching ethics, strategy, and social cohesion. Poets, or skalds, held a revered position in society, combining artistry with memory and history. Vikings were also skilled craftsmen. Intricate jewellery, carved wood, and metalwork reveal sophistication and attention to detail. Ships themselves were works of art, sleek, functional, and adorned with decorative motifs. These creations reflected both aesthetic values and social identity, showing that Vikings appreciated beauty alongside utility. Even literacy existed, though not widespread. Runes were used for memorials, inscriptions, and practical communication. These symbols were both functional and symbolic, blending artistic expression with record-keeping. By understanding education and art, it's clear Vikings were far from barbaric. Their culture valued knowledge, creativity, and storytelling, a counterpoint to the violent, one-dimensional image popularized in myths. Next, we'll explore real battles and strategies, revealing the tactical sophistication behind Viking warfare, which myths often oversimplify as chaotic brutality. Art, storytelling, and knowledge weren't just for beauty or tradition. They also shaped how Vikings fought. Far from the mindless warriors of legend, Viking battles were strategic, calculated, and deeply connected to their society's values and skills. The longship, for example, wasn't just a symbol of exploration, it was a tactical advantage. Its speed and shallow draft allowed Vikings to strike unexpectedly along rivers and coasts, retreat swiftly, and outmaneuver opponents who expected slow, cumbersome invasions. Commanders used terrain, weather, and timing to their advantage, proving that raiding required more intelligence than brute force. Archaeological evidence shows that weapons and armour were practical and carefully maintained. Swords, spears, and shields were tools of both defence and offence, and their design reflected efficiency and adaptability. Viking warriors trained extensively, coordinating movements and formations that minimised casualties while maximising impact. Even the sagas, often seen as exaggerated, reveal insights into strategy. Leaders planned alliances, surprise attacks, and retreats, emphasising tactical thinking over mere aggression. Victories weren't just about valour, they were about preparation, planning, and understanding both allies and enemies. And yet, these battles were relatively rare compared to daily life. Most Vikings were farmers, traders, and artisans, using combat skills primarily for protection, political leverage, or economic gain rather than constant conquest. The popular image of endless pillaging misrepresents the reality of their society, which balanced aggression with diplomacy, negotiation, and survival. Understanding their military strategies enriches the picture of Viking life. They were not chaotic brutes, they were intelligent, adaptable, and capable of sophisticated coordination, a reflection of the same creativity and planning seen in their art, trade, and navigation. Next, we'll step beyond land and into the sea, examining life and death at sea, where Viking exploration, travel, and navigation reveal both the risks and the ingenuity that myths often overlook. Viking life wasn't confined to farms, longhouses, or battlefields. The sea was central to their world, both a highway for trade and exploration, and a dangerous arena that tested skill, courage, and resilience. Longships were marvels of engineering, sleek, fast, and capable of navigating rivers, coasts, and open ocean. These vessels made Viking expansion, commerce, and diplomacy possible, enabling journeys that reached as far as Byzantium and North America. Life aboard a longship was harsh. Crews endured freezing temperatures, storms, and the constant threat of capsizing. Navigating without modern tools relied on keen observation of stars, waves, and landmarks, as well as extensive oral knowledge passed down through generations. Voyages required careful planning, provisions, and teamwork, a far cry from the reckless, romanticized image of Vikings endlessly roaming the seas for conquest. Vikings weren't just warriors or traders, they were also storytellers, artists, and surprisingly literate. Education in Viking society wasn't formal like today, but knowledge passed from one generation to the next was structured, intentional, and essential. Children learned farming, crafting, navigation, and the sagas, absorbing practical skills alongside cultural values. Storytelling was central. Sagas, poems, and oral histories preserved lore, genealogies, heroic deeds, and moral lessons. These weren't mere entertainment, they were the cultural backbone, teaching ethics, strategy, and social cohesion. Poets, or skalds, held a revered position in society, combining artistry with memory and history. Vikings were also skilled craftsmen. Intricate jewellery, carved wood, and metalwork reveal sophistication and attention to detail. Ships themselves were works of art, sleek, functional, and adorned with decorative motifs. These creations reflected both aesthetic values and social identity, showing that Vikings appreciated beauty alongside utility. Even literacy existed, though not widespread. Runes were used for memorials, inscriptions, and practical communication. These symbols were both functional and symbolic, blending artistic expression with record-keeping. By understanding education and art, it's clear Vikings were far from barbaric. Their culture valued knowledge, creativity, and storytelling, a counterpoint to the violent, one-dimensional image popularized in myths. Next, we'll explore real battles and strategies, revealing the tactical sophistication behind Viking warfare, which myths often oversimplify as chaotic brutality. Art, storytelling, and knowledge weren't just for beauty or tradition. They also shaped how Vikings fought. Far from the mindless warriors of legend, Viking battles were strategic, calculated, and deeply connected to their society's values and skills. The longship, for example, wasn't just a symbol of exploration, it was a tactical advantage. Its speed and shallow draft allowed Vikings to strike unexpectedly along rivers and coasts, retreat swiftly, and outmaneuver opponents who expected slow, cumbersome invasions. Commanders used terrain, weather, and timing to their advantage, proving that raiding required more intelligence than brute force. Archaeological evidence shows that weapons and armour were practical and carefully maintained. Swords, spears, and shields were tools of both defence and offence, and their design reflected efficiency and adaptability. Viking warriors trained extensively, coordinating movements and formations that minimised casualties while maximising impact. Even the sagas, often seen as exaggerated, reveal insights into strategy. Leaders planned alliances, surprise attacks, and retreats, emphasising tactical thinking over mere aggression. Victories weren't just about valour, they were about preparation, planning, and understanding both allies and enemies. And yet, these battles were relatively rare compared to daily life. Most Vikings were farmers, traders, and artisans, using combat skills primarily for protection, political leverage, or economic gain rather than constant conquest. The popular image of endless pillaging misrepresents the reality of their society, which balanced aggression with diplomacy, negotiation, and survival. Understanding their military strategies enriches the picture of Viking life. They were not chaotic brutes, they were intelligent, adaptable, and capable of sophisticated coordination, a reflection of the same creativity and planning seen in their art, trade, and navigation. Next, we'll step beyond land and into the sea, examining life and death at sea, where Viking exploration, travel, and navigation reveal both the risks and the ingenuity that myths often overlook. Viking life wasn't confined to farms, longhouses, or battlefields. The sea was central to their world, both a highway for trade and exploration, and a dangerous arena that tested skill, courage, and resilience. Longships were marvels of engineering, sleek, fast, and capable of navigating rivers, coasts, and open ocean. These vessels made Viking expansion, commerce, and diplomacy possible, enabling journeys that reached as far as Byzantium and North America. Life aboard a longship was harsh. Crews endured freezing temperatures, storms, and the constant threat of capsizing. Navigating without modern tools relied on keen observation of stars, waves, and landmarks, as well as extensive oral knowledge passed down through generations. Voyages required careful planning, provisions and teamwork, a far cry from the reckless, romanticised image of Vikings endlessly roaming the seas for conquest. Maritime travel also shaped Viking society culturally and economically. Coastal settlements flourished because of trade, fishing and boat building. Navigational expertise and ship design reflected sophisticated understanding of physics, hydrodynamics and materials science. The sea demanded ingenuity, discipline and adaptability, qualities that define the Viking approach to both exploration and conflict. Even mythology intertwined with seafaring. Sagas often frame voyages as both literal and symbolic journeys, exploring human endurance, fate, and the relationship between people and the natural world. Life at sea tested not only physical limits, but also social cohesion, as sailors depended on leadership, cooperation, and trust in each other to survive. Through these voyages, Vikings were connectors, traders, and explorers rather than mere raiders. Their journey shaped Europe, influenced distant cultures, and left legacies that extend beyond the battlefield. Observing their maritime life allows us to appreciate their intelligence, resilience, and curiosity. The real driving forces behind a society often misrepresented as violent and primitive. Viking life wasn't confined to farms, longhouses, or battlefields. The sea was central to their world, both a highway for trade and exploration, and a dangerous arena that tested skill, courage, and resilience. Longships were marvels of engineering, sleek, fast, and capable of navigating rivers, coasts, and open ocean. These vessels made Viking expansion, commerce, and diplomacy possible, enabling journeys that reached as far as Byzantium and North America. Life aboard a longship was harsh. Crews endured freezing temperatures, storms, and the constant threat of capsizing. Navigating without modern tools relied on keen observation of stars, waves, and landmarks, as well as extensive oral knowledge passed down through generations. Voyages required careful planning, provisions, and teamwork, a far cry from the reckless, romanticised image of Vikings endlessly roaming the seas for conquest. Maritime travel also shaped Viking society culturally and economically. Coastal settlements flourished because of trade, fishing, and boat building. Navigational expertise and ship design reflected sophisticated understanding of physics, hydrodynamics, and materials science. The sea demanded ingenuity, discipline, and adaptability, qualities that defined the Viking approach to both exploration and conflict. Even mythology intertwined with seafaring. Sagas often frame voyages as both literal and symbolic journeys, exploring human endurance, fate, and the relationship between people and the natural world. Life at sea tested not only physical limits, but also social cohesion, as sailors depended on leadership, cooperation, and trust in each other to survive. Through these voyages, Vikings were connectors, traders, and explorers rather than mere raiders. Their journey shaped Europe, influenced distant cultures, and left legacies that extend beyond the battlefield. Observing their maritime life allows us to appreciate their intelligence, resilience, and curiosity. The real driving forces behind a society often misrepresented as violent and primitive. When people imagine Vikings, they often picture treasure chests overflowing with gold, silver, and jewels, buried in secret locations or plundered from unsuspecting villagers. Movies, games, and even some museum displays reinforce this idea, but the reality is more practical, and just as fascinating. Viking hoards weren't just treasure for treasure's sake. They were safeguards, investments, and sometimes ritual deposits. Wealth in the Viking Age was measured in silver, cattle, and trade goods rather than gold coins alone. Hoards were often buried to protect them during travel, warfare, or times of scarcity, with the intention of later recovery. Archaeological finds confirm this. Many hoards were never retrieved, giving modern audiences the illusion of lost Viking gold. Some hoards served ceremonial or religious purposes, deposited as offerings to gods, spirits, or ancestors. These ritual deposits were not about plunder but about invoking protection, prosperity, or blessing for the community. Misinterpretation of these finds has fueled myths about Vikings as greedy hoarders or treasure-obsessed raiders. The variety of items in Viking hoards is telling. Alongside silver coins and jewellery, archaeologists have found tools, hack silver, cut or bent silver used as currency, and even imported goods. This reveals a complex economy, trade networks, and connections spanning Europe and beyond, rather than simple pillaging for wealth. The stories of hidden Viking treasure often ignore this context, preferring dramatic narratives of secret chests waiting to be unearthed. Yet understanding the practical, economic and ritualistic reasons behind hoards paints a richer, more accurate picture of Viking society. They were strategic, organised, and deeply connected to the objects they valued, not reckless hoarders chasing gold alone. By examining hoards, we glimpse the Vikings' priorities: security, trade, ritual, and legacy. The myths of endless treasure and plundered villages begin to fall away, revealing a society both clever and culturally sophisticated. Vikings didn't just leave behind hoards and ships, they left their most personal mark, their bodies. Archaeological analysis of Viking burials offers a wealth of insight, challenging long-held assumptions about their height, health, and lifestyle. Contrary to the stereotype of towering, battle-hardened warriors, most Vikings were similar in stature to their European contemporaries, averaging around 5 feet 7 inches for men and slightly shorter for women. Skeletal remains reveal strong, muscular builds from daily labour, farming, rowing, crafting, but not the exaggerated image of relentless fighting machines. Burials were deeply symbolic and highly varied. Some included weapons, jewellery, tools, or imported goods, indicating social status, occupation, or ritual significance rather than purely martial identity. A grave with a sword didn't always belong to a warrior. It could represent leadership, honour, or ceremonial status. Female burials with weapons have also been identified, reinforcing the idea that women could hold significant social or martial roles. Analysis of bones shows diet and health patterns. Vikings consumed a balanced mix of protein, grains and dairy, and they were affected by common ailments like arthritis or dental issues, not constant injury from endless fighting. These findings contrast sharply with the image of Vikings as perpetually brutal or physically unwell from their supposed violence. Even burial sites offer stories of mobility and cultural exchange. Isotopic studies reveal that some individuals grew up far from where they were buried, highlighting travel, trade, and migration patterns that blur the lines between local and foreign. Vikings were not isolated raiders. They were part of expansive networks connecting Scandinavia to Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. By studying skeletons, we see Vikings as real people, hard-working, mobile, and socially complex rather than the monstrous or purely heroic figures of myth. Their remains, combined with artifacts and sagas, give a multi-dimensional view of their society, helping historians correct centuries of exaggeration. Next, we'll examine Viking ships in museums, contrasting their preserved, sometimes dramatized displays with the practical realities of life at sea. Viking ships are some of the most iconic symbols of their culture. Step into a museum and you're likely to see a massive, beautifully preserved vessel, sometimes placed on a pedestal or surrounded by dramatic lighting. It's awe-inspiring. But these displays can distort the reality of what ships meant to Vikings and how they were used. Many museum reconstructions emphasize size, artistry, or theatrical flair. While these ships were indeed impressive, their primary purpose was practical: transport, trade, exploration, and occasional raids. Speed, maneuverability, and shallow drafts allowed navigation of rivers and coastal waters, not just epic voyages for glory. The emphasis on warships in exhibits can exaggerate their combative role, overshadowing the fact that most journeys were peaceful and economically motivated. Archaeological analysis also shows that not all preserved ships were meant for long-distance travel. Some were ceremonial, intended for burial purposes, or symbolic representations of status. Museums occasionally blur these distinctions, unintentionally promoting myths about endless raiding and heroic battles. Moreover, the challenges of reconstruction can lead to inaccuracies. Missing timbers, eroded materials, or incomplete artifacts require curators to make educated guesses. Artistic interpretation fills gaps, but it can also amplify myths, especially when paired with dramatic narratives or promotional materials for tourism. Understanding the practical role of ships transforms our perception. Vikings were innovative engineers, skilled sailors, and pragmatic explorers. Their ships were tools for survival and connection, not just vehicles for cinematic heroics. Realizing this lets us appreciate the ingenuity behind their voyages, rather than accepting a purely romanticized vision. From ships, our story moves inland to lost cities and settlements, examining how myths of hidden Viking strongholds have overshadowed the actual archaeological record. Wow. Viking ships are some of the most iconic symbols of their culture. Step into a museum and you're likely to see a massive, beautifully preserved vessel, sometimes placed on a pedestal or surrounded by dramatic lighting. It's awe-inspiring. But these displays can distort the reality of what ships meant to Vikings and how they were used. Many museum reconstructions emphasize size, artistry, or theatrical flair. While these ships were indeed impressive, their primary purpose was practical: transport, trade, exploration, and occasional raids. Speed, maneuverability, and shallow drafts allowed navigation of rivers and coastal waters, not just epic voyages for glory. The emphasis on warships in exhibits can exaggerate their combative role, overshadowing the fact that most journeys were peaceful and economically motivated. Archaeological analysis also shows that not all preserved ships were meant for long-distance travel. Some were ceremonial, intended for burial purposes, or symbolic representations of status. Museums occasionally blur these distinctions, unintentionally promoting myths about endless raiding and heroic battles. Moreover, the challenges of reconstruction can lead to inaccuracies. Missing timbers, eroded materials, or incomplete artifacts require curators to make educated guesses. Artistic interpretation fills gaps, but it can also amplify myths, especially when paired with dramatic narratives or promotional materials for tourism. Understanding the practical role of ships transforms our perception. Vikings were innovative engineers, skilled sailors, and pragmatic explorers. Their ships were tools for survival and connection, not just vehicles for cinematic heroics. Realizing this lets us appreciate the ingenuity behind their voyages, rather than accepting a purely romanticized vision. From ships, our story moves inland to lost cities and settlements, examining how myths of hidden Viking strongholds have overshadowed the actual archaeological record. From settlements, we turn to the written word itself, the sagas. Now, we'll explore how translation, storytelling, and exaggeration created myths that persist to this day. The sagas are some of our richest sources of Viking history, but they're also one of the most misunderstood. Written centuries after the events they describe, often by Christian scribes, these epic tales mix fact, legend, and literary embellishment. Misinterpretation over time has fueled countless myths about Viking life, culture, and behaviour. Sagas were meant to entertain, instruct, and preserve cultural memory. Heroes are larger than life, battles are dramatic and moral lessons are emphasized. When modern readers or historians take these stories literally, they risk mistaking poetic license for historical fact. This is how tales of constant raiding, unstoppable warriors, or mystical berserkers gained traction. Translation issues add another layer of distortion. Words describing status, social roles, or combat could be misread, leading to exaggerated notions of violence or gender roles. Nuances of Old Norse poetry, metaphor, alliteration, and symbolic imagery were often flattened or lost entirely in translation, giving sagas a more literal, brutal appearance than intended. Archaeology helps correct some of these misreadings. While sagas might describe grand battles or mythical creatures, physical evidence often shows more measured realities: settlements, trade, and everyday life, not constant chaos. Cross-referencing textual accounts with artifacts, burial sites, and environmental data allows historians to separate historical kernels from literary flourishes. By understanding the sagas in context, we gain a richer, more accurate view of Viking society. Myths survive because stories captivate, but reality is just as compelling if we take the time to read between the lines and consider the people behind the legend. Next, we'll examine Viking symbols and misinterpretation, uncovering how familiar imagery has been distorted in modern times. When you picture Vikings, what comes to mind? Horned helmets, axes, and Thor's hammer. These symbols are ingrained in popular culture, but many are misunderstood or exaggerated. Understanding their true meaning helps separate myth from historical reality. Take the horned helmet, for instance. There's no archaeological evidence that Vikings ever wore them in battle. The image originated in the 19th century theatre and romanticised illustrations, designed to appear dramatic and fierce for audiences. Yet museums, movies, and cartoons often repeat this visual, cementing the myth over generations. Axes and swords are equally symbolic. While weapons were real and necessary, they also represented status, heritage, and skill, not constant aggression. A beautifully crafted axe might be ceremonial, marking social standing, rather than a tool for indiscriminate violence. Runes and symbols also get misread. Runes weren't magical in the way fiction portrays. They were a practical writing system used for communication, memorials, and record-keeping. Symbols like Thor's hammer represented protection and cultural identity, not a call to mindless aggression. Misinterpretation arises when modern audiences project fantasy or stereotype onto these objects, ignoring their nuanced historical context. By exploring these symbols carefully, we see Vikings as a society with rich cultural and spiritual meaning, not merely as the caricatures of war and pillage that dominate pop culture. Recognizing the original intent of these symbols helps us appreciate the depth and sophistication of their worldview. From symbols, we move into the larger debate, how museums and popular media sometimes get Viking history wrong. Even with modern archaeology, Viking history isn't free from debate. Excavations, reconstructions, and interpretations often spark controversy, sometimes revealing more about contemporary biases than about the Vikings themselves. Take burial mounds, for example. Early archaeologists frequently assumed graves with weapons belonged to men, and graves with jewellery belonged to women. DNA testing has overturned many of these assumptions, showing that women could be warriors or hold high status. These misinterpretations shaped decades of textbooks, museum exhibits, and popular understanding. Reconstructed sites and ships also generate debate. When only fragments survive, curators must make educated guesses. But these choices can inadvertently reinforce myths, like portraying Vikings as uniformly violent or romanticising certain features for aesthetic appeal. Critics argue that some reconstructions prioritise spectacle over historical accuracy, creating a tension between education and entertainment. Even discovered artefacts are sometimes contested. Coins, jewellery, or tools may be misdated, misattributed, or misread, leading to sweeping claims about Viking reach, wealth, or technology, that later turn out to be inaccurate. Archaeology is a science, but it's also interpretive, and interpretations evolve as new methods and technologies emerge. These controversies highlight a key point. History is rarely fixed. Understanding Vikings requires critical thinking, skepticism of oversimplified narratives, and a willingness to revise assumptions based on evidence. Myths often persist because they are compelling, but archaeology provides tools to untangle legend from reality. By examining these debates, we can appreciate the challenges historians face in reconstructing Viking life, and why popular myths are so persistent. The next step is to look at how these myths leapt from dusty ruins into modern pop culture, influencing movies, games, and TV shows that have shaped global perceptions of Vikings. Vikings on film are larger than life, savage warriors swinging axes under stormy skies, horned helmets glinting in the sun, and epic battles unfolding in slow motion. Hollywood, with its flair for drama and spectacle, has done more than any history book to cement the image of Vikings as relentless raiders. Shows like Vikings and films such as The 13th Warrior prioritize action and character drama over historical accuracy. Directors and writers lean on myths because they are visually compelling and immediately recognizable to audiences. Horned helmets, berserkers, and endless pillaging make for exciting storytelling, even if they distort reality. Even animated films and historical dramas aimed at younger viewers simplify Viking culture into easily digestible tropes, aggressive, adventurous, and fearless. These portrayals reinforce centuries-old myths while rarely exploring daily life, trade, religion, or the sophisticated social structures that truly defined Viking society. Despite inaccuracies, pop culture adaptations aren't entirely negative. They spark curiosity. A viewer might watch a Viking epic and wonder, was that real? Leading them to explore sagas, archaeological discoveries, or historical texts. The challenge lies in distinguishing entertainment from education, and in recognizing the gaps between myth and reality. Vikings on the big screen are captivating, but the real stories of traders, explorers, craftsmen, and leaders offer just as much drama, complexity, and ingenuity. Understanding how myths shape popular media allows us to appreciate both the spectacle and the historical truth behind it. From the big screen, myths spread even further into interactive experiences. Now we'll examine how gaming has popularized and distorted Viking culture for a new generation of enthusiasts. If you've ever picked up a controller and played games like Assassin's Creed Valhalla or Skyrim, you know Vikings are everywhere. Axes swinging, longships sailing, and raids happening at the push of a button. Video games have brought Viking myths to life like never before, but they also blur the line between reality and fantasy. In Assassin's Creed Valhalla, for example, you can lead epic raids across England, duel rival chieftains, and explore sprawling settlements. It's thrilling, but it's also a carefully crafted narrative that prioritizes fun over historical accuracy. Horned helmets, Czech berserker fury, absolutely. Daily life, trade negotiations, or the quieter aspects of Viking society, not so much. Games like Skyrim take it even further, creating entire worlds inspired by Norse mythology. Dragons, magic, and mythical creatures dominate the experience, giving players an immersive fantasy, but again, far removed from reality. While the stories are inspired by Viking culture and sagas, they amplify legends, exaggerate combat, and often erase the human day-to-day side of Viking life. That said, these games are a gateway. Players who enjoy the action might pause and ask, wait, did Vikings really do that? Suddenly they're reading sagas, learning about shipbuilding, or exploring archaeological finds. Video games, as much as movies, fuel curiosity, but they also cement the idea of Vikings as larger-than-life warriors and raiders. The takeaway? Gaming turns myths into interactive adventures, but the real Vikings were far more complex. They were traders, explorers, and storytellers, not just characters in a combat-heavy fantasy world. Appreciating both the game and the history lets us enjoy the excitement without mistaking myth for fact. Next, we'll dive into comic books and cartoons, exploring how Vikings have been simplified, exaggerated, or sanitized for all ages. Okay, picture this. Vikings with oversized axes, colourful helmets, and personalities as bold as their battle cries, jumping out of comic books or animated shows straight into your imagination. For generations, kids and adults have been introduced to Vikings this way, and while it's fun, it's also packed with myths. Comics and cartoons often strip away the nuance of real Viking life. Heroes and villains are exaggerated, and the focus is almost always on adventure, treasure, and combat. Real aspects like farming, trade, and navigation rarely make the cut. Instead, we get caricatures, fearless warriors, clever tricksters, or magical beings straight from Norse mythology, all simplified for storytelling punch. Even when targeted at children, these portrayals leave lasting impressions. A young viewer might assume horned helmets were real, or that Vikings lived only for raiding and fighting. Yet these media forms also spark curiosity. A fun story can be the first step toward exploring sagas, history books, or museums to learn the real deal. Interestingly, some comics do dive deeper, showing Viking life through a more accurate lens, exploring family, trade, or the struggles of survival in harsh climates. These attempts, however, are few and often overshadowed by flashy, action-oriented content. The big takeaway? Comics and cartoons have made Vikings legendary, but they've also simplified their society into digestible, myth-filled snapshots. Understanding this helps us enjoy the stories while knowing there's much more depth and complexity behind the animated adventures. From print and animation, myths have spilled into everyday life in unexpected ways. Advertising, festivals, and tourism have all borrowed these images, shaping how modern culture views Vikings. Ever noticed how Vikings are everywhere in marketing? From craft beers to snack foods, from travel brochures to clothing brands, the Viking image is used to sell excitement, toughness, and adventure. And let's be honest, it works. The horned helmets, fierce expressions, and long ships aren't just decoration. They're a shortcut to adventure in your mind. But here's the twist. Most of what's being sold has little to do with historical reality. A beer label featuring a horned Viking? Pure myth. A travel ad promising real Viking experiences? Mostly dramatized reenactments and tourist-friendly shows. Companies leverage the myths we've been fed for centuries because they're instantly recognizable and emotionally powerful. Even modern Viking festivals, often tied to advertising campaigns, emphasize battles, costumes, and spectacle rather than everyday life, trade, or culture. These events reinforce the cinematic Viking, larger than life, action-packed, and steeped in legend. Merchandise, logos, and branding all rely on the same visuals: axes, longships, runes, and horned helmets, turning centuries-old myths into a marketing goldmine. The fascinating part? This commercialization keeps the Viking image alive, even if it's skewed. It's a reminder that myths aren't just historical mistakes. They're tools for storytelling, identity, and culture. The danger is that repeated exposure reinforces inaccurate perceptions, blurring the line between legend and reality. Yet, once you know the truth about trade, exploration, family life, and social structure, the myths become even more interesting. Marketing Vikings tells one story, but history tells another, richer and far more complex tale. Step into a Viking festival today, and it's like walking straight into a storybook. People in fur-lined tunics clash swords on wooden platforms, longships glide across lakes, and the air smells of roasted meats and campfire smoke. These festivals are immersive, exciting, and undeniably fun. But they also blend myth with reality in ways that are easy to mistake for history. Reenactments focus on the dramatic, battles, heroic feats, and mythical characters. Horned helmets, berserker roars, and epic duels dominate the stage, feeding the cinematic Viking image that generations have grown up with. The quieter, more practical sides, farming, trade, family life, rarely get centre stage, even though they define the majority of Viking existence. Yet, there's value here too. These events spark curiosity and engagement. Visitors, especially younger ones, get a tactile sense of Viking life, handling replica tools, trying traditional crafts, or learning about shipbuilding. It's a way to experience history interactively, even if it comes wrapped in layers of myth and dramatization. The key is perspective. Viking festivals are storytelling as much as education. They celebrate imagination, culture, and heritage, while giving us glimpses of reality beneath the dramatization. Observing them critically teaches us to separate spectacle from historical fact, appreciating both the performance and the truth. From these lively performances, we step back to consider why these myths endure, exploring the psychology and culture that keep Viking legends alive. Vikings capture our imagination in a way few historical societies do. But why do myths about horned helmets, berserkers, and endless raiding survive, even in the age of archaeology and digital media? The answer lies in psychology, culture, and storytelling. Humans are wired to remember stories, especially dramatic ones. Tales of heroic battles, terrifying warriors, and hidden treasure stick in the mind far more easily than mundane details about farming, trade, or domestic life. Myths simplify complex societies into digestible, emotional narratives, making them easy to share across generations. Cultural reinforcement plays a role too. Movies, video games, comics, and festivals all repeat the same dramatic tropes, embedding them into collective memory. Museums, despite best efforts, sometimes choose visually striking displays over nuanced accuracy, because audiences respond more strongly to spectacle. Over time, these repeated images become accepted as truth, even when they're largely fictional. Finally, myths endure because they serve identity and meaning. For some, Vikings symbolize adventure, courage, and independence. They're a canvas onto which modern societies project values, ideals, and fantasies. Even when historians uncover the real story of traders, explorers, and skilled community builders, the myth persists because it's emotionally compelling. Understanding why myths endure gives us tools to approach history critically. We can enjoy the thrill of legendary Vikings while appreciating the depth, intelligence, and humanity of the real people behind the stories. Myths aren't lies. They're a form of cultural storytelling that reflects both the past and our present imagination. From this reflection, we move into the untold stories of Vikings, exploring the realities behind the myths, where we reimagine Viking women, global interactions, and societal complexity. Vikings capture our imagination in a way few historical societies do. But why do myths about horned helmets, berserkers, and endless raiding survive, even in the age of archaeology and digital media? The answer lies in psychology, culture, and storytelling. Tales of heroic battles, terrifying warriors, and hidden treasure stick in the mind far more easily than mundane details about farming, trade, or domestic life. Myths simplify complex societies into digestible, emotional narratives, making them easy to share across generations. Cultural reinforcement plays a role too. Movies, video games, comics, and festivals all repeat the same dramatic tropes, embedding them into collective memory. Museums, despite best efforts, sometimes choose visually striking displays over nuanced accuracy because audiences respond more strongly to spectacle. Over time, these repeated images become accepted as truth, even when they're largely fictional. Finally, myths endure because they serve identity and meaning. For some, Vikings symbolize adventure, courage, and independence. They're a canvas onto which modern societies project values, ideals, and fantasies. Even when historians uncover the real story of traders, explorers, and skilled community builders, the myth persists because it's emotionally compelling. Understanding why myths endure gives us tools to approach history critically. We can enjoy the thrill of legendary Vikings while appreciating the depth, intelligence, and humanity of the real people behind the stories. Myths aren't lies. They're a form of cultural storytelling that reflects both the past and our present imagination. From this reflection, we move into the untold stories of Vikings, exploring the realities behind the myths, where we reimagine Viking women, global interactions, and societal complexity. Viking women often get left out of the story, or worse, reduced to silent waiting figures. But archaeology, sagas, and historical records reveal that women were far more powerful and influential than popular myths suggest. They weren't just mothers and wives, they were leaders, warriors, and key figures in trade and religion. Take graves like the one at Birka in Sweden, where a woman was buried with a full set of warrior gear. DNA analysis confirmed she was female, overturning centuries of assumptions. This tells us that women could lead, fight, and hold social authority, a reality ignored by most Hollywood depictions. Women also played critical roles in commerce. They managed farms, oversaw trade, and sometimes negotiated with foreign merchants. Some even acted as chieftains or influential advisors, shaping political alliances and ensuring the survival of their communities while men were away raiding or trading. Religion provided another avenue for influence. Women could serve as seeresses or priestesses, guiding rituals, interpreting omens, and maintaining spiritual life within the community. Their authority was both practical and symbolic, reinforcing their central role in Viking society. Everyday life was equally complex. Women ran households, educated children, crafted textiles, and maintained social networks. Their labour and leadership were foundational to the Viking economy and culture. By reimagining Viking women in their full context, we see a society where gender roles were dynamic and multifaceted, challenging the simplified myths of passive, subservient figures. They were active participants in shaping the Viking world, and their stories are finally emerging from the shadows of legend. Next, we'll expand the lens globally, exploring Vikings in a wider context and how interactions with other cultures reshape our understanding of their society. Vikings weren't isolated raiders confined to Scandinavia. They were active participants in a vast, interconnected world. Trade, diplomacy, and travel brought them into contact with Byzantium, the Islamic caliphates, and even Central Asia, challenging the stereotype of Vikings as solely European marauders. Archaeological finds show coins from the Middle East, luxury goods from North Africa, and textiles from Central Asia in Viking settlements. These artifacts reveal sophisticated networks of exchange. Vikings acted as merchants, negotiators, and cultural intermediaries, not just plunderers. Diplomacy was equally important. Alliances were forged through marriage, negotiation, and treaties. Vikings served as mercenaries for foreign rulers, notably the Varangians in Byzantium, blending military skill with loyalty and political savvy. Travel expanded their worldview. From the icy coasts of Greenland to the bustling markets of Constantinople, Vikings adapted to diverse environments, learned foreign languages, and navigated unfamiliar political landscapes. This mobility and curiosity allowed them to thrive in regions far from home. By understanding Vikings globally, we see a people defined by connection, adaptation, and influence. They weren't isolated barbarians. They were integral players in the medieval world, bridging continents and cultures. Next, we'll delve into Viking religion and philosophy, exploring their ethical frameworks, moral codes, and spiritual life beyond the myths of brutality. Viking religion wasn't just about gods and sacrifices. It was a framework for understanding the world, guiding behaviour, and making sense of life's uncertainties. The Norse pantheon, Odin, Thor, Freya, and countless others, represented values, natural forces, and ethical ideals rather than simply inspiring fear or violence. Philosophy in Viking culture revolved around honour, reputation, and community responsibility. Laws and codes of conduct were passed down orally, reinforced through sagas and local assemblies called things. Courage, loyalty, and fairness weren't abstract ideals. They were practical necessities for survival and societal cohesion. Spirituality extended to everyday life. Rituals marked the seasons, celebrated births and marriages, and sought protection for homes and harvests. Even seemingly violent practices, such as ritual sacrifices, were symbolic acts embedded in cultural meaning, not indiscriminate brutality. Ethics were also explored through storytelling. Sagas depicted moral dilemmas, consequences of betrayal, and rewards for cleverness or courage. Heroes weren't just warriors, they were thinkers, negotiators, and strategists, reflecting the Viking appreciation for intellect alongside strength. By examining religion and philosophy together, we see Vikings as a people with complex moral reasoning, capable of reflection, strategy, and social organisation. Their spirituality was intertwined with law, ethics, and daily life, far removed from the caricature of a purely violent pagan society. From their belief systems, we now turn to another form of knowledge, medicine and science, revealing how Vikings approached health, herbalism, and survival. Contrary to the image of Vikings as ignorant or brutish, they had a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of medicine, health, and practical science. Healing wasn't magical. It was rooted in observation, experience, and herbal knowledge passed down through generations. Herbal remedies formed the backbone of Viking medicine. Plants like yarrow, juniper, and chamomile were used to treat wounds, fevers, and infections. Archaeological evidence shows that these remedies were applied systematically, demonstrating empirical knowledge rather than superstition alone. Surgical practices, though rudimentary by modern standards, existed as well. Trepanation, skull surgery, and bone setting appear in skeletal remains, suggesting an understanding of anatomy and healing. Longships carried first aid knowledge for sailors and raiders, indicating preparation and care for injuries during travel. Vikings also applied practical science in everyday life. Shipbuilding required knowledge of hydrodynamics and material properties, while farming demanded understanding of crop cycles, soil, and livestock health. Trade and navigation relied on mathematics, astronomy, and engineering skills. Even ritual and spirituality intersected with science. Offerings, ceremonies, and festivals were often timed with seasons or astronomical events, reflecting careful observation of the natural world. Myths may dramatize these practices, but underlying them is a culture attentive to cause, effect, and survival. By exploring Viking medicine and science, it becomes clear that they were innovators, observers, and learners, not the unthinking barbarians often depicted in popular media. Their intelligence, curiosity, and adaptability allowed them to thrive across diverse and challenging environments. Next, we'll examine trade, economy, and wealth, revealing how Vikings accumulated resources through skill and strategy, rather than just plunder. Forget the idea that Vikings got rich only by raiding. Most of their wealth came from trade, resource management, and economic strategy. Far from the endless plunderers of legend, Vikings were skilled merchants, negotiators, and innovators, connecting distant regions and cultures. Markets thrived in Viking towns, where silver, furs, amber, textiles, and luxury goods from as far away as Byzantium and the Middle East exchanged hands. These networks required careful planning, knowledge of foreign currencies and diplomacy. Wealth wasn't just hoarded, it circulated, fueling settlements, shipbuilding and cultural development. Even raiding, when it happened, often had economic and political motives rather than sheer greed. Vikings targeted strategic locations to gain resources, secure trade routes, or strengthen alliances. Plunder was one tool among many, not the defining feature of their economy. Craftsmanship and local production were equally important. Metalworkers, carpenters, and textile makers created goods for both domestic use and trade, demonstrating a sophisticated economy rooted in skill and organisation. Women played a key role here, managing estates, producing textiles, and facilitating trade, further highlighting the complexity of Viking society. Understanding Viking wealth shifts our perspective. They were not reckless marauders, they were strategic, adaptable, and connected. Trade and economic acumen were central to their success, shaping communities, politics, and even cultural exchange across Europe and beyond. From economics, we turn to the people less often celebrated in history, the Vikings you've never heard of, from little-known leaders to overlooked settlements and voyages. When most people think of Vikings, names like Ragnar, Leif Erikson, or Eric the Red come to mind. But the real Viking world was far richer, filled with leaders, explorers, and communities that rarely make the headlines. These lesser-known figures and settlements reveal a more nuanced and fascinating history. Take Gudrid Thorbjarnardottir, for example. She was an explorer, trader, and settler whose journeys took her from Iceland to Greenland and even to North America, centuries before Columbus. Her story shows courage, resourcefulness, and leadership, qualities often overshadowed by the legendary men of Viking sagas. Small settlements across Europe, the British Isles, and the North Atlantic also played critical roles. Communities in Ireland, Normandy, and the Faroe Islands were centres of trade, craft, and cultural exchange, not just raiding outposts. Archaeological digs reveal houses, workshops, and marketplaces that paint a picture of daily life far removed from popular myths of constant violence. Even ordinary Vikings had extraordinary stories. Farmers became skilled navigators, women managed estates and trade, and minor chieftains negotiated alliances across kingdoms. These stories remind us that history isn't just about the famous, it's about the everyday people whose choices and ingenuity shape their world. By exploring these overlooked figures and settlements, we see a Viking world full of diversity, skill, and adaptability, challenging the narrow images often portrayed in media. Their lives were complex, their achievements remarkable, and their legacies profound. After diving into centuries of myths, legends, sagas, and archaeological evidence, it's time to take a step back and see the Viking world for what it truly was. Forget horned helmets, berserkers, and endless pillaging. What emerges is a society that was complex, adaptive, and deeply human. We've seen that Viking women were leaders, warriors, and traders, that their wealth came largely from trade and skill, not just plunder, that their ships were engineering marvels, built for exploration and commerce as much as for raids, that their religion and philosophy reflected ethics, law, and social cohesion rather than unthinking brutality. Even the myths themselves, so persistent in pop culture, media, and festivals, serve a purpose. They inspire curiosity, entertain, and preserve culture, even if they oversimplify or dramatize reality. Understanding both the myths and the truths gives us a richer appreciation of Viking life, highlighting the human ingenuity, resilience, and creativity that have been overshadowed by legend. In essence, the Vikings were explorers, merchants, storytellers, and innovators. They navigated the seas, traded across continents, and left behind a cultural legacy that continues to fascinate. Myths endure because they captivate, but reality, as we've uncovered, is just as thrilling, if not more so. As we prepare to close this journey, it's worth reflecting on what these revelations teach us, to question narratives, to seek evidence, and to find excitement in history that is both true and deeply human. Next, we'll turn to the Vikings' legacy in the modern world, exploring how myths and reality coexist in today's culture. Step into any Scandinavian city, museum, or festival today, and the Vikings are still very much alive, though not quite the way Hollywood imagines them. Modern Viking culture is a mix of heritage, tourism, and reinterpretation, showing how myths and reality coexist in fascinating ways. Museums showcase reconstructed ships, weaponry, and everyday tools, often alongside interactive exhibits that let visitors experience Viking life firsthand. Meanwhile, festivals celebrate the spectacle, costumes, reenactments, and storytelling, keeping the dramatic myths alive for entertainment. This blend of fact and fantasy keeps Vikings relevant in contemporary culture, drawing millions of curious visitors each year. Vikings also influence identity and branding, from Scandinavian airlines using Norse imagery to companies selling Viking-inspired products. The myths are powerful symbols of adventure, resilience, and cultural pride. Yet, in communities and educational programs, the focus is shifting toward accuracy and nuance, teaching people about trade, exploration, family life, and societal structures. Today's interest in Vikings isn't just nostalgia, it's curiosity. People want to understand the real lives behind the legends, the traders, navigators, and storytellers whose ingenuity shaped Europe and beyond. By engaging with both myth and reality, we connect with the Vikings as complex, human, and enduring figures rather than just cinematic characters. From modern life, we pivot back to the institutions that curate their history. Step inside a museum today, and you'll notice a shift in how Vikings are presented. Gone are the days of relying solely on dramatic displays or mythical exaggerations. Modern curators strive to balance spectacle with historical accuracy, blending artifacts, interactive exhibits, and storytelling to give visitors a real sense of Viking life. Exhibits now highlight daily routines, trade networks, and social structures, alongside the iconic ships and weapons. Children can try spinning wool, adults can examine trade goods from distant lands, and everyone can see that Vikings were as much farmers, traders, and artisans as they were warriors. Digital technology also plays a role. Augmented reality lets visitors explore reconstructed longhouses, sail virtual ships, or watch reenactments of festivals, all while contextualizing what is historically accurate versus mythologized. Even 3D scans of burial sites and artifacts allow people to explore Viking life with unprecedented depth and detail. These changes are not just educational, they reshape perception. Audiences learn that Vikings were innovative, adaptable, and culturally sophisticated, challenging the stereotypes ingrained by centuries of myth, media, and merchandising. At the same time, museums face a delicate balance: how to engage audiences with exciting displays while maintaining scholarly integrity. Some exhibits still lean on dramatic storytelling, but there's a growing trend toward transparency, helping visitors appreciate both myth and reality. From the museum halls, we take a broader perspective in, exploring what the endurance of these stories teaches us about culture, psychology, and human curiosity. Viking myths have persisted for centuries, not just because they're entertaining, but because they speak to something fundamental about human nature. They reflect our fascination with heroism, danger, and adventure, and they reveal how stories shape culture, identity, and perception. One lesson is the power of storytelling itself. Myths simplify complex societies into narratives that are easy to remember and share. Horned helmets, berserkers, and epic raids aren't historical fact, but they're memorable symbols that convey ideas about courage, ingenuity, and the unknown. Understanding this helps us see myths not as lies, but as cultural shorthand for values and imagination. Another lesson is the importance of questioning narratives. History, especially popular history, is filtered through interpretation, translation, and bias. By comparing sagas, archaeology, and artifacts, we uncover layers of truth beneath the legends. This teaches us critical thinking, curiosity, and respect for evidence, skills that extend far beyond Viking studies. Finally, myths remind us that culture is dynamic. Viking stories have been adapted, commercialized, and dramatized for centuries, yet they continue to inspire. They bridge past and present, connecting us to human experiences of exploration, trade, creativity, and survival. By studying myths alongside history, we gain a richer, more nuanced understanding of the Vikings, and, in turn, ourselves. They show us how imagination and reality can coexist, shaping knowledge, entertainment, and cultural identity. Looking back on the Viking world, it's clear that history is rarely as simple as the myths we inherit. The horned helmets, berserkers, and non-stop raids are captivating, but they only tell part of the story. When we dig deeper, through archaeology, sagas, and cultural studies, a richer, more complex picture emerges. Vikings were not merely warriors, they were traders, explorers, farmers, and storytellers. They navigated seas, forged alliances, and built communities. Women held power, religion guided ethics, and education, craft, and diplomacy were all integral to society. Recognizing these realities allows us to see them as human beings with ingenuity, strategy, and resilience, rather than caricatures of violence. Reflecting on this history also teaches us about ourselves. The myths that endure reveal how humans process and remember events, emphasizing drama, heroism, and moral lessons. They remind us to question narratives, consider multiple perspectives, and appreciate the layers of meaning behind cultural stories. In the end, the Viking legacy is both mythic and real. By balancing fascination with critical inquiry, we honour their ingenuity while understanding the power of storytelling. Myths and facts coexist, each enriching our understanding of who Vikings were and why their story still resonates today. As we reach the end of this journey through Viking myths and realities, it's worth pausing to take it all in. From horned helmets to fearless berserkers, from epic raids to bustling trade routes, the Vikings we thought we knew were only part of the story. The real Vikings, innovative, adaptive, and deeply human, were far more fascinating than legend alone could convey. Myths endure because they capture our imagination, thrilling us with adventure and drama. Reality captivates differently, with ingenuity, resilience, and human complexity. By exploring both, we gain a richer, deeper understanding of a society that shaped much of medieval Europe and beyond. The legacy of the Vikings is still alive today, in museums, festivals, literature, and media. But knowing the truth behind the stories allows us to engage with that legacy critically and thoughtfully. It reminds us that history is a living dialogue between fact, interpretation, and imagination. So next time you see a Viking helmet, a dramatic reenactment, or a heroic saga, remember, there's a story behind the story. Seek it out, explore it, question it. The thrill of discovery is just as enduring as any myth, and it's waiting for anyone curious enough to look beyond the legend. In the end, the Vikings teach us more than history. They teach us how to think, question, and marvel at the human capacity for adventure, creativity, and storytelling. And with that, our voyage through myths and reality comes to a close, leaving us with curiosity, perspective, and a deeper appreciation for the lives of the people behind the legend. Alright guys, that's a wrap on our deep dive into the world of Vikings, myths, legends, and the real stories behind them. I hope you enjoyed uncovering the truth as much as I did sharing it with you. If you love this journey through history, make sure to smash that like button, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss an adventure into the past. Hit the bell icon too so you get notified every time we drop a new video. Thanks for watching everyone, have an amazing night and I'll see you in the next story. Good night.